Wow. You've really outdone yourself with these sources for this deep dive.
Yeah,
Aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems.
it's amazing stuff.
We're talking everything from like the ocean surface all the way down to those crazy trenches and then out and over to like lush rainforests and the tundra. I mean,
Yeah, and it's just incredible how diverse life on Earth is, but it really I think this deep dive shows how it all kind of boils down to these like fundamental units, these ecosystems.
yeah, totally. So before we like get into the nitty-gritty, what exactly are we talking about when we say ecosystem?
So an ecosystem is like this community, okay, organisms interacting with each other and of course their environment. It's like it's really a complex web of life. Everything has its place and its role.
Okay, so they're definitely more than just like pretty to look at then. Why are they so important?
Oh, they're way more than just pretty. They actually regulate our climate. They purify our air and water.
Yeah.
They even provide us with like food and resources. And probably most importantly, they support the incredible biodiversity that we see on Earth.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely important. So let's dive in. I'm really interested in this first category of ecosystems you've got here, aquatic ecosystems.
Yeah.
What makes them so special?
Well, it's in the name, right? They're all based in water.
Yeah.
And we can like categorize them even further by how much salt is in the water, the salinity. So freshwater ecosystems like lakes and rivers, they have really low salt. But marine ecosystems, now those are your oceans and coral reefs, and they've got a lot more salt.
Okay, let's start with the ocean then. It's like the biggest ecosystem on the planet.
Yeah.
And in these sources, the way they describe the different layers of the ocean, each one with like its own unique life forms, it's incredible.
It is. It's like traveling to different planets, but you're still here on Earth, right? The ocean is so vast, it creates this huge range of habitats. From the surface, where the sun always shines, to the deepest, darkest depths, where the pressure is unimaginable.
Right. And at the top, you have the epipelagic zone, the sunlight zone, and it is just teeming with life.
Absolutely. And it's all fueled by photosynthesis. That's why you find phytoplankton.
Photosynthesis.
Yeah. You know those microscopic algae? They're like the base for the entire marine food web. They're like the ocean's breadbasket.
Right.
Right? They support this incredible diversity of life, from these tiny little creatures to huge marine mammals.
And then as you go down, like even just a little bit, things change so much. These sources we're talking about, the mesopelagic zone, like the twilight zone, where the light starts to fade, and these creatures have developed these insane adaptations.
Yeah, the twilight zone. It's pretty dark down there, I'll tell you that. It's also got crazy pressure. And yet, it's so interesting how those creatures have adapted. Take bioluminescence.
Oh, yeah.
Lots of animals in the twilight zone, like squid and jellyfish, they produce their own light. It's how they talk to each other, how they attract prey, even how they defend themselves.
It's like something straight out of a movie. And then even further down, you've got the abyssopelagic zone. It's completely dark down there, right? Like midnight zone and the pressure, I can't even imagine.
The midnight zone, it's a trip. Those creatures down there are really remarkable. They've adapted to survive in the most extreme environment. I mean, it's freezing down there. Food is hard to come by. It's amazing.
Like what kind of adaptations are we talking about?
Well, a lot of deep-sea fish have super slow metabolisms, so they need less food and less energy. Some of them have even lost their eyesight completely.
Really?
Yeah, it's wild. They rely on other senses to navigate and find food. And then there are others with these huge mouths and these stomachs that can expand, so if they find something to eat, they can eat something like way bigger than them.
That's amazing.
And-
Life really does find a way.
But
But it doesn't end there, right? There's even more ocean to explore.
oh yeah, we've got to go deeper. Below the abyssopelagic zone is the hadopelagic zone. Now, this is the deepest part of the ocean. We're talking trenches.
Trenches like those deep scars on the ocean floor.
Exactly, formed by the movement of those tectonic plates.
What's it like down there?
Honestly, we don't know that much about the hadopelagic zone because it is so hard to explore. But we do know that the creatures living there have to be able to survive insane pressure, total darkness, and it is freezing down there.
Okay, well, we'll stick to the shallow end for now. So within this vast and mysterious ocean, our sources talk about these specific marine ecosystems that I thought were so interesting. Like coral reefs, I've heard them called the rainforests of the sea.
Yeah, they're pretty incredible. Coral reefs are known for their amazing biodiversity. They're only a tiny fraction of the ocean floor, less than 1%, but they support something like 25% of all marine species.
That's insane. How is that even possible?
Well, it all starts with the corals themselves. They might look like rocks or plants, but they're actually animals. Tiny little invertebrates called coral polyps. And these polyps, they secrete calcium carbonate, which is what forms those hard, stony structures that we think of when we think of coral reefs.
The one tiny little polyp is responsible for building these huge structures.
It's amazing,
Yeah.
right? One little polyp at a time. And those structures that they build, they provide food and shelter for this incredible diversity of marine life. You've got your colorful fish like parrotfish that eat algae and angelfish that feed on sponges. Then you've got invertebrates like sea anemones, which you might recognize from Finding Nemo.
Oh, yeah, those are so cool.
Yeah, they hang out with the clownfish, and then you've got jellyfish just kind of floating around with those trailing tentacles. And of course, you can't forget about the predators, the sharks and barracuda patrolling the reefs looking for a smack.
It's incredible. And it all has to stay in balance. Speaking of balance, our sources also talked about giant kelp forests, which are underwater forests formed by this type of brown algae. That can grow crazy tall.
Giant kelp forests. They're pretty cool. They grow in these cool, nutrient-rich waters, usually along coastlines. And they're just as important as coral reefs when it comes to biodiversity. These underwater forests provide food, shelter, a place for all kinds of creatures to breed. We're talking everything from tiny little invertebrates to giant marine mammals.
What kind of creatures are we talking about here?
Yeah. I mean, you name it. Sea urchins love to munch on the kelp. And then the sea otters, they eat the sea urchins so their populations don't get out of control. And rockfish and other types of fish, they like to hide in the kelp. And then you've got seals and sea lions hunting for those fish. Even gray whales will stop by a kelp forest to snack on krill.
It's like a jungle down there, a jungle with its own set of rules and residents. And it's all connected. But these kelp forests don't just support marine life, do they? I was reading that they actually help regulate the entire ocean.
That's right. You know how trees on land, they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? Well, kelp does that too. It's called photosynthesis, and it helps fight climate change.
So they're like the trees of the ocean.
You could say that. And just like trees, they release oxygen into the water, which is how everything breathes down there. And because they grow so quickly, some kelp can grow up to 2 feet a day. They provide a ton of food and energy for the entire food web.
That's amazing. But our journey through aquatic ecosystems isn't over yet because we haven't talked about estuaries. Those are those cool areas where the rivers meet the sea, right?
Estuaries are amazing. They're always changing because you've got the fresh water from the river mixing with the salt water from the ocean. It creates this gradient of salinity.
And what does that mean for the creatures that have to live there?
They have to be tough. They have to be able to handle all kinds of different salinity levels and temperatures. The water level changes all the time. There are strong currents and tides.
So basically, they're the ultimate survivors.
Yeah, pretty much. And get this, even with all of those challenges, estuaries are some of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. Because that constant flow of nutrients from the rivers and the ocean creates this like super nutrient-rich environment. So life just flourishes there.
Makes sense.
Yep.
And a lot of marine species rely on estuaries as nurseries for their young too, right?
Absolutely. Those shallow protected waters are the perfect place for fish and crabs and all kinds of marine animals to lay their eggs. It gives their young a safe place to grow and develop.
So we've gone from the deepest depths of the ocean to these really productive estuaries, which actually kind of reminds me, we haven't even talked about freshwater ecosystems yet.
And those are just as diverse as marine ecosystems. Our sources broke them down into 2 main categories, eolentic and lotic. Lentic is your still water habitats, so lakes and ponds. Lotic, that's your flowing water.
Yeah.
Rivers and streams.
Let's stick with the flow for now. What makes rivers and streams stand out?
Well, it's the flow, right? That constant movement of water. It's what makes rivers and streams so dynamic. It shapes the habitat, and it influences what kinds of organisms can survive there.
So the river is like carving its own path.
Yeah, it's like a sculptor, always shaping and reshaping. And that constant movement is really important, too, because it carries nutrients and oxygen and even organisms throughout the whole ecosystem. It's like rivers are the veins of our planet, connecting everything and letting things flow from one place to another.
And you have to imagine that living in a constantly moving environment like that requires some pretty serious adaptations.
Oh, absolutely. Creatures that live in rivers and streams, they've had to evolve to survive. A lot of them have these streamlined bodies, so they can move through the water without a ton of resistance. Some of them can even cling to rocks or dig down into the stream so they don't get swept away. And then you've got fish like salmon that are famous for swimming upstream against the current to get to their spawning grounds.
That's incredible. Okay, so we've covered the constantly moving rivers and streams. What about those more still waters, like lakes and ponds?
They might look calm and peaceful on the surface, but under the water, it's a different story. Lakes and ponds are full of life. Just like the ocean, they've got different zones, and each zone has its own unique characteristics and its own set of inhabitants.
So we're back to zones again.
Exactly. And just like in the ocean, it all comes down to light and nutrients. At the top, you've got the littoral zone. That's the shallow water near the shore where the sun can reach. The littoral zone is like a hive of activity. You've got plants like cattails and water lilies providing cover for insects and amphibians and fish.
It's like its own little ecosystem.
It really is. Then, as you move away from the shore, you get to the limnetic zone. This is the open water where the sun can still penetrate. This is where the phytoplankton rule.
Those little guys are everywhere.
They're the foundation of the aquatic world. Phytoplankton are the primary producers in the limnetic zone. They convert sunlight into energy, and that energy supports a whole bunch of zooplankton and small fish, and even bigger predatory fish.
Okay, so we've got the sunny littoral zone and the open limnetic zone. What's next?
Well, just like the ocean lakes get a little less inviting as you go deeper. The profundal zone, that's where the light starts to fade and the temperature drops. There's not much sunlight down there, so it's not as productive as the upper layers.
So what kind of creatures can live in that cold, dark water?
You'll find some fish down there. But they're mostly bottom feeders. They scavenge for dead organisms and other organic material that floats down from the upper zones. It's not a glamorous life, but hey, it's a living.
And then at the very bottom is the benthic zone, right? The lake bed?
That's right. The benthic zone is actually really important. It's where all the decomposers live. Those are the bacteria and fungi that break down dead stuff and waste products and release nutrients back into the water. Those nutrients then get used by the phytoplankton up in the limnetic zone, and the cycle continues.
Wow, so even at the bottom of a lake, there's this whole cycle of life and death and renewal.
It's all connected, and that interconnectedness, that's something you see in every ecosystem, from the largest ocean to the smallest pond.
Speaking of connections, our sources also went into wetlands. Those are those unique areas where the land meets the water, right?
Wetlands are so cool and so important. They're like giant sponges. They soak up excess water when it rains a lot, which helps to reduce flooding and erosion.
So they protect us from those big storms.
Yeah, they act like natural buffers. And they're also like giant filters. They remove pollutants and excess nutrients from the water. That's why they call wetlands the kidneys of the planet.
That makes a lot of sense. And on top of all of that, wetlands are also incredibly biodiverse.
They really are. Wetlands provide a habitat for so many different plants and animals. A lot of them are actually threatened or endangered species. You've got your wading birds like herons and egrets, amphibians like frogs and salamanders, reptiles like alligators and turtles, even mammals like beavers and otters.
Wow, it's like a zoo out there. But unfortunately, it sounds like these incredible ecosystems are in trouble.
Yeah, it's true. We're losing wetlands at an alarming rate. People drain them for agriculture and development. And when we lose wetlands, we don't just lose the species that depend on them. We also lose those natural defenses against flooding and erosion, and our water quality suffers, and it even contributes to climate change.
So we really need to be protecting these vital ecosystems. Okay, we spent a lot of time talking about water. Let's dry off and head to dry land, where we encounter a whole new set of challenges and adaptations. The realm of terrestrial biomes.
From rainforests to deserts to the frozen tundra, terrestrial biomes showcase the incredible diversity of life on land.
And as we explore these different biomes, our sources pointed out the key factors that really shape them and determine what kind of life can exist there.
And those are temperature and precipitation.
So how hot or cold it gets and how much rain or snow falls.
Exactly. Those two factors, along with things like sunlight and soil composition, they create a huge range of environmental conditions. And those conditions are what determine what kind of plants and animals can live in a particular region.
And our sources identified 8 major terrestrial biomes, each with its own unique set of characteristics and adaptations. Let's start with the one that's probably the most well-known, the tropical rainforest.
Tropical rainforests are found near the equator where it's warm and humid all year round. All that warmth and moisture creates the perfect conditions for plant growth. That's why you see those lush canopies of trees that stretch up to the sky.
And all those plants must support a ton of animal life.
No, absolutely. Tropical rainforests are home to an estimated 50% of all plant and animal species on Earth. And that's even though they only cover about 6% of the planet's land surface.
That's wild. What kind of adaptations do animals need to survive in such a competitive environment?
Well, when you've got that many species all competing for resources, things can get pretty cutthroat. A lot of rainforest animals have evolved to eat very specific things, or they've developed unique ways of getting their food so they don't have to compete directly with other species.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, so think about a toucan. They've got that huge, colorful beak, right? It might seem kind of awkward, but it's perfect for reeking fruit that's high up in the canopy. Other birds can't get to it.
It's like their own personal fruit picker.
Exactly. And a lot of rainforest animals have also developed adaptations for climbing and gliding and camouflage. They have to be able to navigate this really complex three-dimensional world.
That's so cool. Okay, so we've got the rainforest. What about the savanna? Those grasslands with scattered trees.
Savannas are found in tropical and subtropical regions. They've got those really distinct wet and dry seasons. They're kind of like a transition zone between rainforests and deserts.
And they're home to some of the most iconic animals on the planet.
Totally. We're talking lions, elephants, giraffes. The savanna has it all. The grasslands support these huge herds of herbivores like zebras and wildebeest and gazelles. They migrate across the savanna following the food and water.
And where you have large herds of prey, there are predators lurking nearby.
Oh yeah, lions, cheetahs, leopards. They all depend on those big herds of herbivores to survive.
It's like this big game of chess out there, with predators and prey constantly trying to outsmart each other.
It's a good way to put it. And even the plants in the savanna have adapted to survive these harsh conditions.
What kind of adaptations are we talking about?
Well, a lot of savanna trees, like the baobab, they've got these really thick trunks that can store water during the dry season. And the grasses have these deep root systems that allow them to reach water deep underground, even when the surface is bone dry.
So even with drought and fire, life finds a way in the savanna.
Life is incredibly resilient, and these adaptations are proof of that.
It really is amazing how life can exist in places you wouldn't expect. Speaking of unexpected places, our next biome is the desert.
Yeah, deserts can seem, well, pretty desolate at first glance, all that sand and heat. But they're actually full of life. Life that has adapted to survive with almost no water and those extreme temperatures.
It's all about water conservation in the desert, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Everything in the desert has had to develop ways to find, store, and conserve every drop of water.
Like what kinds of adaptations are we talking about?
Well, cacti are a great example. Those spines that we think of as like the quintessential cactus feature, those are actually modified leaves. They help the cactus conserve water by reducing transpiration. Yeah, it's how plants lose water through their leaves. And cacti also have those shallow, widespread root systems. So when it does rain, they can soak up as much water as possible, as quickly as possible.
It's like they've evolved their own water collection system.
Exactly. And then you've got animals like the kangaroo rat. They get all the water they need from the seeds they eat. And their kidneys have adapted to produce super concentrated urine so they don't lose any extra water.
That's incredible. They've really got it figured out. Okay, let's go from the hot, dry desert to the other extreme, the tundra.
The tundra is pretty wild. Long, cold winters, short, cool summers, and of course permafrost, that permanently frozen layer of soil underneath the surface.
So with conditions that harsh, what can even survive up there?
Well, you're not going to find a lot of trees. The permafrost makes it really hard for them to grow. But you do find other plants. Mosses, lichens, dwarf shrubs. They've adapted to grow low to the ground where it's a little warmer and they can avoid those harsh winds.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And the animals, how do they deal with the cold?
Well, a lot of tundra animals like Arctic foxes and caribou, they change color with the seasons. They grow a white coat in the winter to blend in with the snow, and then a brown coat in the summer to blend in with the trees and the dirt.
So they've got their own camouflage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you've got other animals like bears that just sleep through the whole winter.
Can't argue with that strategy. But what about polar bears? They don't hibernate, do they?
Nope. Polar bears are perfectly adapted to life on the sea ice. They've got that thick layer of blubber for insulation and to help them float, and their paws are huge with these rough pads and non-retractable claws, so they've got amazing traction on ice and snow.
They're like built for it.
Yeah.
Okay, we've seen the frozen tundra. What's next?
How about the chaparral? It's a biome characterized by hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters.
Sounds like a pretty nice place to live. Where can I find this chaparral?
You'll find it in regions with a Mediterranean climate, so like a California coast or around the Mediterranean Sea. The plants there are mostly these dense, shrubby plants that have adapted to survive those long, dry summers.
What kind of adaptations help them survive?
A lot of chaparral plants have tough, leathery leaves to minimize water loss. Some of them even produce oils that make them more likely to burn, which sounds counterintuitive, but those fires actually help them in the long run because they clear out the competition, and a lot of chaparral plants need fire to germinate their seeds.
So they've adapted to not only survive fire, but actually depend on it.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
a really cool adaptation. Okay, our next biome is the temperate grassland. These are the areas that are defined by those vast stretches of grass and the lack of trees.
I've heard that temperate grasslands have some of the most fertile soil on Earth.
You heard right. It's because the grasses die back every year and decompose, which adds a ton of organic material to the soil. And that makes it super fertile and productive. It's why so much of the world's agriculture happens in temperate grasslands.
So with all those grazing animals, what kind of adaptations do plants need to survive?
A lot of grassland plants have developed deep root systems that help them regrow quickly after they've been grazed on or burned. And they tend to grow from the base of the plant rather than the tips, so the growing point doesn't get damaged.
That's smart. It's like they're one step ahead. Okay, enough about grasses. Let's talk trees.
Right.
What about temperate deciduous forests?
Ah, yes. Those are the forests with those beautiful fall colors. Temperate deciduous forests are found in regions with moderate rainfall and 4 distinct seasons with warm summers and cold winters. And they're named for those deciduous trees, the ones that lose their leaves in the fall.
Right. And those falling leaves create those stunning displays of red and orange and yellow. But why do they do that? It seems like a strange strategy, just dropping all your leaves like that.
Well, it's all about conserving energy and surviving the winter. In the fall, when the temperature drops and the days get shorter, the trees stop producing chlorophyll. That's the pigment that gives leaves their green color and allows them to photosynthesize.
So they lose their green and all those other colors come out.
Exactly. And once the leaves have fallen, they decompose and release all those nutrients back into the soil, which helps the trees grow new leaves in the spring.
It's a whole cycle.
It is. And it's not just the trees. Temperate deciduous forests support a whole bunch of different plants and animals. Deer, squirrels, woodpeckers, owls, they all play a part in this incredible ecosystem.
It's like a perfectly orchestrated dance. Speaking of amazing forests, we can't forget about the boreal forest.
Ugh. The boreal forest, also known as the taiga. This is a massive forest that circles the globe in the northern hemisphere. It's actually the largest terrestrial biome on Earth.
And it's known for its long, cold winters.
You got it. Those winters can last for 6 months or even longer, and the temperature can get crazy cold, way below freezing.
So what kind of trees can survive that?
Conifers. Those are your evergreens. Trees like pines, spruces, firs. Their needles are specially adapted to conserve water and handle those freezing temperatures.
What about those adaptations? What makes them so special?
Well, for starters, their branches are super flexible, so they can handle heavy snowfalls without breaking. And their needles have this waxy coating that prevents water loss and protects them from the cold.
They're like the superheroes of the tree world. But what about the animals that live there? How do they deal with those harsh conditions?
A lot of boreal forest animals, like snowshoe hares and ermines, they change color, just like the animals in the tundra. Light in the winter, brown in the summer.
So camouflage is key.
It's essential. And some animals, like bears, they just hibernate through the winter. But then you've got others, like wolves and lynx, that tough it out. They rely on their amazing hunting skills to survive the winter, preying on deer, moose, rabbits, whatever they can catch.
Every biome has its own set of challenges, and it's amazing how life has figured out a way to survive and thrive in all of them. But our exploration of ecosystems wouldn't be complete without talking about some of the big picture concepts that govern how these complex systems work. Our sources spent some time on ecological succession. What is that exactly?
So ecological succession, it's basically the process of change that happens in an ecosystem over time. It's how ecosystems recover and rebuild after something like a fire or a flood, or even something like deforestation.
So like nature's way of starting over.
Exactly. And it can take a really long time. We're talking decades, centuries, even millennia. And it usually starts with what we call pioneer species. These are the first organisms to colonize a disturbed area.
So who are these pioneer species? What do they look like?
Well, they're usually pretty hardy and adaptable. They can handle tough conditions and poor soil. Think like lichens, those things you see growing on rocks, or mosses. They can break down rock and create a thin layer of soil, which makes it possible for other plants to start growing.
They're like the first responders,
Yeah.
making the area livable again.
Yeah. They pave the way for other species to move in. And as those pioneer species start to grow and change the environment, it becomes more attractive to other plants and animals. Over time, the ecosystem goes through these different stages of succession. Each stage has its own dominant species and environmental conditions.
So the ecosystem is constantly evolving.
Always changing. And eventually, if you leave the ecosystem alone for long enough, it'll reach a state of stability. That's what we call a climax community.
So the climax community is like the final form of the ecosystem.
In a way, yes. It's characterized by high biodiversity complex food webs, a good balance between energy production and consumption. It's reached a point of equilibrium with its environment.
It's like the end goal of ecological succession.
You could say that. But it's important to remember that ecosystems are dynamic. Things are always changing. Even in a mature ecosystem, there are disturbances, fires, storms, disease outbreaks. And when those disturbances happen, the process of succession starts all over again.
It's a never-ending cycle of change and adaptation. Speaking of adaptation, our sources also talked about keystone species. What are those again?
Keystone species are those species that have a huge impact on their environment, even if there aren't that many of them. They're like the glue that holds the whole ecosystem together.
So even though they might not be the most common species, they have a really important role.
They're essential, and if you take a keystone species out of an ecosystem, it can have a ripple effect on everything else.
It's like,
Now,
what? Can you give me an example?
sure. Think about sea otters. They're a keystone species in kelp forest ecosystems. Sea otters eat sea urchins, and sea urchins eat kelp. So by keeping the sea urchin population in check, sea otters help keep those kelp forests healthy. And those kelp forests provide food and habitat for all kinds of other species.
So what happens if the sea otters disappear?
Well, without the sea otters to control them, the sea urchin population explodes. They eat all the kelp and the whole ecosystem is thrown out of whack. The fish that depend on the kelp forests for food and shelter, they start to disappear. The water chemistry changes, even the physical structure of the habitat can change.
Wow, so it all comes back to balance. Even a small change can have huge consequences.
Exactly. And that's why keystone species are so important. They're like the guardians of the ecosystem. But let's move on to another fascinating aspect of ecological communities, symbiotic relationships. These always blow my mind.
Yeah, I'm ready to have my mind blown. What are symbiotic relationships again?
So symbiotic relationships are these close, long-term interactions between two different species that live in close proximity. They can be good for both species, or just one species, or even bad for one of the species. It really just depends on the relationship.
So there's a whole spectrum of symbiotic relationships.
Exactly. Probably the most well-known type is mutualism. That's where both species benefit from the relationship.
So it's like a win-win.
Exactly. A classic example is bees and flowers. Bees need the nectar and pollen from flowers for food, and as they're buzzing around from flower to flower, they're also spreading pollen, which helps the flowers reproduce. So it's a win-win for both of them.
They need each other to survive.
Pretty much. But then you've got relationships where it's not quite as equal, like commensalism. That's where one species benefits and the other one doesn't really care one way or the other.
So one species is getting a free ride, basically.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
A good example of this is the relationship between remora fish and sharks. Remoras have this special suction disc on their head that lets them attach themselves to sharks. So they get a free ride and they eat any scraps of food the shark leaves behind. The shark just kind of ignores them.
It's like a symbiotic road trip.
That's a good analogy. But then, of course, there are the relationships where one species benefits and the other one suffers. That's parasitism.
Though not as fun as a road trip.
Definitely not. The parasite benefits by living in or on the host, and the host is harmed in some way. A classic example of this is tapeworms. They live in the intestines of mammals, including humans, and they absorb nutrients from the host's digestive system, which can make the host really sick.
Yeah, that's not a relationship I want to be a part of.
That
But even though parasites can be disgusting, they do serve a purpose, right?
They do. They help keep things in check. They can help control host populations and prevent any one species from taking over. They can also influence host behavior and even drive evolution. So even though we might not like them, they are an important part of the web of life.
Everything has its role, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, it's been amazing exploring all these different ecosystems with you. But we have to talk about the elephant in the room, the impact that humans are having on all of this.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we can't talk about ecosystems without talking about the impact that humans are having. We're talking habitat destruction, pollution, overexploitation, climate change. Our actions are having a serious impact on the planet.
It's definitely a downer, but it's also a wake-up call, right? We have to be more aware of our impact and start making changes.
Absolutely. And it's not all doom and gloom. People all over the world are working to protect the environment, from international agreements to protect biodiversity to local efforts to restore damaged ecosystems. There's a lot of good happening too.
It's going to take all of us working together.
It will. We need to shift our mindset. We're not separate from nature. We're a part of it.
We're all connected.
Exactly. So as you continue to learn about these amazing ecosystems, I hope you'll remember that their fate is tied to our own. What impacts them impacts us.
That's a really powerful message. Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. Thanks for sharing all this amazing information with us.
It's been my pleasure. Keep asking questions. Keep learning. The more we understand about these ecosystems, the better equipped we'll be to protect them.
That's right. And on that note, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.